Well, good afternoon. I'd like to add my welcome to all of you to this year's East Joint Warfighting Conference. I particularly want to thank Vice Admiral Pete Daly and our partners at the U.S. Naval Institute as we have gone through the planning and execution of this event. I think you will find that we have an incredibly strong program this week. I hope that you're all taking advantage of all of the professional development opportunities as we go through the week. Many of the sessions have continuing education units assigned to them. Please consult your program to determine which have continuing education units and make sure that you register for those sessions so that you get credit for those units. Well, I think you're in for a treat at lunch today. You heard Admiral Gortney this morning, if you were here for the opening keynote, talk about the current period as a period of change and choice in a challenging budget environment. So our luncheon speaker today, the Honorable Frank Kendall, Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, guides much of that process of change and choice, and certainly has to work with the challenging budget environment. So I can't think of anybody better qualified to talk to us today in this present environment. Secretary Kendall has over 40 years of experience in engineering, management, defense acquisition, and national security affairs in private industry, in the government, and in the military. He started out as a distinguished graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, holds a master's degree in aerospace engineering from California Institute of Technology, a Master of Business Administration from the C.W. Post Center of Long Island University, and is also an attorney, having graduated from the Georgetown University Law Center. He is an attorney and has also been very active in the field of human rights. He was confirmed by the Senate to his current position in May of 2012 and has been in this role for about a year. And of course, in this role, he's the leader of the Department of Defense efforts to increase the department's buying power and to improve the performance of the defense acquisition enterprise. Please join me in a warm AFCEA and U.S. Naval Institute for the Honorable Frank Kendall.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Naval Institute and AFCEA for putting on this, can I call it a conference? Am I allowed to call it a conference? I understood that coming in, somebody mentioned to me that conference has become a four-letter word. That's some sort of efficiency initiative, I guess, shorten the number of letters. A lot of these conferences have enormous value. A lot of these technical interchanges, if you will, they're meetings in which people from industry and the government get together. We learn a lot from each other. We make a lot of progress on many, many issues. And unfortunately, because of a couple of aberrations, I think, they've kind of gotten a bad name, and it's been a little harder to put them on, and it's been harder in the government for people to attend them. But they do have enormous value, so I was delighted to have the invitation to come down and have a chance to speak to you today. And I applaud the fact that you're still doing this, that you're getting everybody together for what I think from the agenda is a very, very productive meeting. Admiral Gortney, I understand, really did extremely well this morning in his talk. I know him very well from his time on the Joint Staff. And I guess I've got a tough act to follow there, so I'll do my best. Unfortunately, I'm going to talk about some things that are not exactly uplifting. I'm going to talk about the budget a little bit and the implications of the budget and sequestration in particular. But that's the reality that we're living in, so I'm going to deal with it head on. What I normally do at conferences is when I give talks is I ask people to hand out 3x5 cards so that people have questions, they can kind of write them down. I'm an engineer, basically, despite what you heard earlier in the introduction, and that makes me an introvert automatically, I think, pretty much. And I like to encourage people to ask questions by giving out 3x5 cards. But my understanding is that in this conference, you're doing this through texting, is that right? Or through emails? All right. Anyway, if you are, I think that's terrific. And I'm a little embarrassed as the the Undersecretary for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics said I'm not doing something similar, and I'm being so old-fashioned as to use 3x5 cards. So I'm going to take that out of the conference is something that I learned here. I'm going to start by going through some of a description, I guess, if you will, of the current situation. It's not very pleasant, okay? We have been through a process in the department where, first of all, we received a new budget figure, if you will, about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now, out of the Budget Control Act. And based on that, we did a strategic review of kind of a mini QDR, if you will. It said, okay, if this is the level of resources we're going to have, what does that imply for the department in terms of what the department should look like? What should the force structure look like? What mission should we be able to do? What kind of modernization should go with all that? What readiness levels do we sustain? There was a conscious decision at the time by Secretary Panetta and General Dempsey to look out 10 years roughly, 5 to 10 years, at the Defense Department we'd like to build going forward if we had to take about $50 billion a year out of the budget over 10 years, each year. So we did that, and we came up with a budget we felt pretty comfortable with. But before we did the budget, we came up with a strategy. And we let the strategy drive what we put into the budget. We published the strategy first. It was pretty well received. Then we published the budget. That was our FY13 submission. And then off we went. And now we were living at that time under the threat of sequestration, which was kind of built into the Budget Control Act in the summer of 2012. We did not expect sequestration to happen. The reason we didn't expect it to happen was that it was set up to not happen. It was set up to be something that was so unpleasant, so unacceptable, that we would avoid it, and that the Congress would do something more rational, obviously, to avoid something as horrible as sequestration levels of cuts. Bill Lynn, who was the Deputy Secretary at the time, said that after this was passed, that the idea was to do something so crazy that nobody would let it happen, and they did a really good job. Well, I think as we all know today, they didn't do a good enough job. So here we are. You know, we had I think we were right initially that the Congress is probably not going to let sequestration happen, but unfortunately we got into a political position after the tax law was adjusted on the first of the year, where we went down the path to where it became a default that the Congress could accept, at least enough of the Congress that we couldn't go forward. So we're dealing with it. We're dealing with it in FY13. We're trying to deal with it right now in what I would call a damage limitation mode. You know, we're essentially doing the best we can to get through it. You know, in the midst of this, of course, we were building our FY14 budget, which was consistent with our strategy again, and it did not assume sequestration. That was the situation we're in as we went through all the long, year-long process of building the budget. And we kind of had a dilemma at the end of the year about what to submit to the Congress. And we still believe that the strategy was correct, that the level of funding associated with that strategy was correct, and that's the right course. That's where the administration is. So we set up the FY14 budget basically with the idea that 13 was an aberration and that sequestration could still possibly be reversed. You know, what is needed, of course, to do that is some kind of a budget deal that addresses the deficit issue that is the triggering mechanism for sequestration. I will have to tell you that I am becoming less optimistic about the outcome, at least going into FY14 now, because the political pressures and the urgency of doing this don't seem to be where I'd like to see them. I just don't see the forcing function right now. We do have the debt ceiling coming up on us. It looks like that'll be fairly late in the year now, out in the September timeframe, and the Congress will be forced to raise the debt ceiling. There's no question, I think, among rational people, but that the government must pay its debts. And to default on our debts is something that just isn't acceptable. You know, we said things like that about sequestration once, though, so who knows? But I think that we will raise the debt ceiling. That doesn't mean that we solve the sequestration problem or that we get a grand bargain or a big deal on the overall problem of revenues and deficit reduction and cost cutting. So we'll go through that. We may very well be under a continuing resolution. If we are under a continuing resolution, it'll be based on this year's level of funding, FY13, which means that we will be at a sequestered level already under the continuing resolution. The only good thing that comes out of this is we will have slightly less inflexibility or less constraints in how we can spend money. Under sequestration right now, we basically having to cut every line item in the budget by about 8%. So that's the way it works in the first year of this 10-year period of sequestration. If we're under a CR, we'd be under the CR rules in 14, and that gives you some flexibility at the account level, which is better, but still not the kind of flexibility we'd like to have to be able to do some planning. In the midst of all of this, the biggest single thing that is driving us crazy in the Pentagon right now, quite honestly, is the lack of stability and the lack of certainty about what's going to happen. We have no clue how this is going to come out. We can take the worst case and do a budget based on that. We didn't do that. We think that's not the responsible way to go forward. But we are planning for that. We've started something called the Strategic Choices Management Review. We're about a little more than halfway through doing that now. It was a tasking that the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Hagel, gave to General Dempsey and to the Deputy Secretary, Dr. Carter, to go take a couple of months to examine what it would mean to the department to have to take lower levels, to accept lower levels of funding. Now, if you look at the options that are in front of us right now, on the Hill, politically, there are three. There's the House bill, which basically keeps funding budget resolution, which keeps funding basically as we would desire. Doesn't cut defense much at all. There's the Senate budget resolution, which takes about $250 billion roughly out over 10 years. And it doesn't start to take that money out seriously until the end of the FIDA, the end of the first 5 years. And then there's the President's budget we just submitted, which takes about $150 billion out and doesn't start to take that out either until the end of the FIDA. So all of those three outcomes are much better than sequestration. None of them are, other than two of them, I think, are probably quite acceptable to us, the President's budget and the House. Even the $250 billion is a significant adjustment that we'd have to go through. So anyway, under the Strategic Choices Management Review, and by the way, there are ways to pronounce that acronym. I'm not allowed to use any of them. I learned a new one today coming in here on the way in. But it's the Strategic Choices Management Review, or SCMR, as far as I'm concerned. In any event, we're going through an exercise to try to understand what we would have to do. And in addition to that, we've had guidance from the Secretary to try to find efficiencies, find ways where we can save money. Now, we did a similar review under Secretary Gates. I've been back in the Pentagon about 3 years now, and shortly after I came in, Secretary Gates, who was very prescient about where we were headed, said we really need to find ways to get more for our money. So we went into an efficiency initiative review that Secretary Gates directed, which was very similar in some ways, in terms of trying to find savings. And I think this community is quite well aware of some of the output that came out of that study. So I'm talking about this region. So we're doing some of those things again. We're looking at all the things we do in terms of how we do business. We're looking at what I do in terms of acquisition. We're looking at information technology. We're looking at a host of things, all the places we basically spend money, every source of spending that the department has, to see if there are ways we can do things better, try to get as out of the box as we can and think about that. But also, of course, we have to go look at the fundamentals. If you're going to take 25 or 50 billion a year out, you need to start with thinking about how much force structure you can support and what's in that force structure. So we have to look at options like that as well. So we're going through this. I will express some concerns about the direction we're headed in general and share some of those with you. And those are concerns even at the budget submission level, at least to some degree. I have a list of priorities that I put out when I first came into actually the deputy's position 3 years ago, which I've essentially continued with some minor modifications. But they include taking care of current operations. Obviously, we're still engaged in conflict in Afghanistan. There's a lot that we have to do about that. Don't start unaffordable programs, things that we can't carry on and get into production and field to the warfighter. Seek efficiencies wherever we can in acquisition. Preserve the industrial base, the defense industrial base. Strengthen it where we can. Take care of our workforce, strengthen the workforce, the government workforce that does acquisition for the government. And then the new one that I've added more recently in the last couple of years is protect the future. I want to talk about the protect the future one a little bit. As I look at what we're doing to ourselves right now under the current situation, we're going to have pressure, I think, to keep force structure and to try to keep that force structure ready. So that's traditional. Okay, traditionally, someone in my position in the Pentagon has been the voice at the table arguing for longer-term investments, particularly research and development, but also new systems. I am not focused as much on current operations and current readiness as most of the building is. I'm focused more on what am I going to have for the department in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. My wife is sometimes asked what I do. She works in a totally different world. She works in a law firm in downtown Washington that has nothing whatsoever to do with defense. But every now and then somebody asks her what her husband does. And she says, well, he works in the Pentagon. And they go, oh, okay. And if they're curious beyond that, they say, well, what does he do? And she then says, well, he buys things. And now if that doesn't convince them I have a very boring job, they then say, well, what does he buy? And her answer to that is everything. So my responsibility in my job, which I would define a little bit differently than that, is that I have to equip and sustain our force structure. I have to make sure it's modernized at a reasonable pace. I have to make sure that it's recapitalized at a reasonable pace. I have to make sure that the force structure that's already out there has the readiness, the spare parts and the other things it needs to sustain it. So that's essentially the nature of my responsibility. I have to do that within the budget constraints of what the Congress appropriates. The secret to doing that successfully is to having balance in the way we acquire things, the way we allocate resources in the budget. So for the force structure and the balance in the budget starts with the force structure. It drives everything else. So you start with the force structure, which costs a certain amount of money in terms of people, paying the salaries and all those things, health benefits, which are hugely rising cost, all those things. It has to do with keeping that force structure ready, which means buying the spare parts, training the people so that they're ready. Then there are the investment accounts, which are recapitalizing that force and modernizing it over time. And if you keep all those in balance, you're going to have a technologically superior force that's ready to do the things you need to do continuously over time. You're not going to take risk near term or long term. You're going to be basically healthy, if you will, from the point of view of meeting national security needs over the long term. So I came into government 3 years ago thinking we were at a pretty reasonable place in terms of that balance. And until about a year and a half or so ago, I felt we were still there. In fact, until recently, I thought that we were still there. I thought that with the resources we had, I could do my share of taking care of that institution, if you will. We're doing a couple things now that are starting to make me nervous. One of them is a direct artifact of sequestration. It's the fact that the cuts are so immediate. When we take out the $50 billion even under the Budget Control Act, and now we're taking $50 billion out near term under sequestration, we can't draw force structure down fast. We can't draw it down for a couple of reasons. One, first of all, there are upfront costs associated with taking people out of the military. Second of all, it's a tough decision for us to make. Third of all, we need the force structure for current operations. And fourth of all, maybe most importantly in some ways, it's not fair to our people. We've been at war for 10 years. And having people get off of their C-17 when they come back and be handed a peak slip as soon as they get off the airplane is really not the way we want to do business for a while. So as we went through the strategic review last year before last, we basically were very conscious of the desire of the services to have a gradual drawdown in force structure. That's fine, but the impact then, if you're taking immediate cuts, is that those cuts land somewhere else. They land on the investment accounts. So that's kind of what happened. What we did in the budget we submitted in 2013 was we cut R&D and we cut procurement. And then as we go out over the 5-year plan, we restored procurement to a large extent, pretty much back to the levels that have been at before the cuts. We did not restore R&D. R&D stayed down. Now, I've raised this issue with the Deputy Secretary and the Secretary. They're aware of it. We're looking at it hard as we go through this year's drill for 15. We're looking at it as part of the Strategic Choices Management Review. But those R&D resources are our investment in our future. This conference is largely about innovation. Innovation comes from R&D spending. And if we don't take care of that as part of that balance that I talked about, we're going to have some problems. Now we come into, of course, the sequestration world, where we're uniformly cutting all the different parts of the budget, including the investment accounts. Now, we're very near to sending a reprogramming to Hill. One of the problems with sequestration was that it initially, of course, because it was based on the FY12 CR, it was totally distorted from what we needed. The bill that was passed a few weeks ago helps a lot. It addresses about a third of the big readiness problem that we had, but it doesn't address it all. So we're going to go back to the Congress very shortly and ask for some reprogrammings to help us with readiness, particularly in the Army. The Army is most engaged, obviously, in the conflict and is most affected that way by sequestration, but they're not the only service that has that problem. So we're going to go try to fix that. Now, Bob Hale and I spent a lot of time on this. He's the Undersecretary for Financial Management, our comptroller. And we have found as many sources for that reprogramming as we can that do not do any more damage than is absolutely necessary to the investment accounts. Unobligated balances where we can slide things a little bit, for example, where we're not executing as fast as we might have been. But at the end of the day, that bill is going to be paid to, in a large extent, by additional cuts from production and from research and development. So that's sort of where we are in terms of getting through 13. 13 is very much a damage limitation exercise right now, partly because of the restrictions we have on sequestration. So going forward, we're going to have that discussion if we go to much lower levels. So with the other $50 billion that may come out starting in 14, I've got the same problem with immediate drop down, and I've got the same problem of trying to protect our future. So what can we do about that? There are a couple of things that we can do. One is we can get to a more reasonable budget arrangement. We can do something that doesn't look like sequestration, that looks like any of the other plans that are before the Congress right now that have a more rational background. That's what we really need to do. The administration's budget that we sent out, the FY14 budget, which essentially ignored sequestration, did not assume sequestration, is probably a better way to put it. We were well aware of it. We weren't ignoring it, is what we really need to do. So we need to try to get to some settlement of all this that gets us to that kind of funding. That's one thing. That's the first thing, obviously. I am looking seriously now at the idea of making some hedging investments in the future. And there are several reasons why we might want to do that. I talked to Bill Perry because there was a kind of a conventional wisdom that I'd heard for years that Bill Perry, who was former secretary, on 2 occasions had done this sort of, had adopted this sort of a strategy. The idea is that even if you can't afford the systems you're developing, you should develop them anyway. If you look at the budget you expect in the future, given current budget levels at least, and you don't see a big increase, and you don't think you can afford the products that you're developing in the future, generally speaking, I would have said you shouldn't develop them. They're not affordable. Why start? Why waste money on programs you're likely to cancel? We have a history of doing that, and it's a waste when we do that. The reason to do it is severalfold. One is it moves the technology forward. Okay? It keeps you ahead of the power curve a little bit in terms of technology. It reduces the lead time for which if you can go into production if the world situation and your budget changes. So that's a good thing. It also allows you to keep some of your key industrial base alive so it's available to you in the future. Because once you lose your design teams and some of those key industrial capabilities, it's not easy to get them back. It takes a long time. It's difficult and it's inefficient. So there's some good reasons to adopt what I would call a hedging strategy in a situation like the one we find ourselves in now. I called Bill Perry and I asked him if he had actually, on the 2 occasions that I was aware of, done this. And his answer was yes. He did it in the 70s. In the 70s, we were about, if you're Army people here, remember the big 5 in the Army? The F-18, the F-15, the F-16 were all coming along in that time frame, the aviation world. Aegis, I think, was coming along at that time as well. Bill Perry constantly made a number of investments in technologies and in programs where he did not foresee budgets big enough to allow us to afford them. Now, what happened after the 70s was the 80s. And in the 80s, Ronald Reagan became president, and we had a big buildup in defense spending. And we bought those products. Those are the products that are in our inventory today, to a very large extent. Okay, fast forward another couple of decades to the 90s. Cold War ends. You know, we're drawing down our force structure dramatically. We're having a procurement holiday. Bill Perry's Secretary of Defense. In the first instance, he was the Director of Defense Research and Engineering, basically the predecessor to my position. In the second instance, he's the Secretary of Defense. So we kept alive a lot of systems that were regarded at the time as Cold War systems. F-22. Arguably, I suppose, the C-17. Well, that's one that we did take into production. It's been a success. A little bit later, the DDG-1000 came out of that era, out of the 90s. Bill kept some programs going in the 90s, and the result was not quite the same. Okay, because we did not have the same kind of a buildup in conventional forces. What we had was 911, and we went off and did the things that we've done as a result of 911. Different situation. Anyway, Bill agreed when I talked to him that this is what he had done, and he felt that it was a strategy well worth considering, so we are thinking about it. The problem we have is that when you have diminished resources, you don't have, and this is the situation the department has today. We do not have a contest over which good idea to fund. We're having a contest right now over which least bad choice to make. Yeah, we had a briefing. I mentioned the IT briefing. This is a little bit of inside baseball. I probably shouldn't go into this, but I'll say it anyway, just as an example. It's an area where, like a lot of other areas, we could make an investment that would have a good return. Now, we could get, if we put some additional money into certain IT investments, we could get that money back in a very few number of years, very quickly. We're like a business that has great product ideas but doesn't have access to capital. It's a very similar situation. We have ways we could save money if we could spend money. We just don't have the money. So we have to choose among least bad things to do as opposed to which good thing to do. Yeah, and so if I look out at the different investments we could make, there are a lot of good investments we could make. That's not the problem I have. When people come and bring to me good ideas, I say, that's fine. What am I going to cut? Because this is a zero-sum game. So anyway, we don't have a lot of flexibility to do the sort of thing I just described, the kind of strategy of hedging R&D investments. So what I'm interested in looking for, and we've already done this a little bit, is examples of places where we can finance some innovation selectively. And one of the things that it's been talked a lot about in the acquisition community over the years is the idea of prototyping. One of the things we can do is prototyping, which is relatively inexpensive compared to engineering and manufacturing development, full-scale development. Getting a product ready to field with all the ilities, the reliability, maintainability, et cetera, requirements that go with that, getting a product ready to field with all the training, logistics base, everything else that we have to do in EMD, the very thorough testing of all the requirements, that's very expensive. Once we commit to EMD, we really should be talking about products that we're going to take into production and field because the expense there is reasonably high. But before that, we can do prototyping, which allows our design teams to do work. It advances the technology, it reduces the risk, and it shortens the lead time if the threat changes and the budget situation changes. So I think on the margins, and very selectively, we may want to do some things like that. The one project that I've started that is headed in that direction is something called the Air Dominance Initiative. I started this about a year ago with DARPA in the lead, and I asked the Navy and the Air Force to participate in this. The idea is to start thinking about what do we do after F-35? F-35, by the way, I use the words cautiously optimistic about the program. I think we've made reasonable progress on it in the last year or so. I've got a big decision coming up this fall about ramping up production in FY15. But unless something surprises me, I'm feeling reasonably comfortable about that. But there's going to be something after the F-35. This world does not stand still. And air dominance is one of the most important military areas we have for conventional warfare. The other thing that is on the horizon that does keep me awake a little bit at night, quite frankly, is the fact that we do have peer competitors or near peer competitors out there who are investing very wisely. We just released our report on China. It's an unclassified report that went up to the Hill. And it talks about some of the, in particular, A2AD investments that China is making. These are focused on keeping the U.S. out of the near area around China and that part of the world, the Western Pacific. And the Chinese, to be honest, are being very smart about those investments. They're very targeted, they're structured strategically, and they're pointed right at keeping us away. And frankly, they're pointed at gaining technological superiority over the United States. I do not want to be the Undersecretary for Acquisition on whose watch we lost technological superiority in field of systems. So I am concerned about that, and I think we need to keep those investments going. And it's important, if I look at protecting the future, and I'm not talking about political, military political things here, I'm not talking about policy things, I'm not suggesting we're going to get into a conflict with China. I'm suggesting that we do not want to be in a position where China is a militarily, technologically superior country to the United States, or anybody else is. The world has been at relative peace for a long time, in large part because of the U.S.'s position militarily. It's a huge influencer over other people's behavior and over geopolitics. And I don't want us to lose that advantage that permeates everything else that we do, not just potential conflicts, but all our relationships around the world. I'd say a little bit more about what I'm doing. The desire to improve the efficiency of the acquisition system is never ending. I've been in this business, as was mentioned, about 40 years. I've actually been in the acquisition piece of it for close to 35. The desire to do things more efficiently and to get more value for our money is certainly not new. And I've lived through a lot of different iterations of acquisition reform by a lot of different labels. I'm not big on labels. I'm not big on slogans. Dr. Carter and I started the Better Buying Power initiatives as part of Secretary Gates' efficiency initiatives. And I've recently published some guidance for Better Buying Power 2.0, which I initially announced last fall and then interacted with industry and others to kind of refine and modify. So we just put out some guidance on that. There are a number of initiatives in there. I would describe these generally as implementing a management philosophy of continuous improvement. I don't believe in fads. I'm more of an evolutionary than a revolutionary manager, if you will. I believe in transformation in bits and pieces. The reason for that is that there's no simple solution to improving defense acquisition. It's an incredibly complicated area. It covers a huge range of products, a huge range of phases of development and life cycle of products, and a huge range of technologies, a huge range of institutional capabilities in government and out of government. It's tough. It's hard business, and it takes professionals who really know what they're doing to do it well. And they have to understand a lot of very complicated things to be successful at it. So improving, when we already have, by the way, a workforce in industry and a workforce in government that is working very hard every day to do the best job they possibly can. Improving is not easy. It's a lot of steps that you take, and you have to learn from what you have done and make adjustments as you go. So Better Buying Power 2.0 is a set of adjustments and additional initiatives from Better Buying Power 1.0. And we will work the details of this. We will sweat the details because that's where progress is going to be made as we go forward. Despite the climate that we're in, the need to do this is greater than ever. Okay, when budgets are tight, it's even more important that we do this. Now, I am concerned about another aspect of the situation we have right now, and that's about people. We ask a lot of our people. We have an incredibly dedicated workforce, both in uniform and out, including in industry and in government. And they do their best every day to produce good products and provide services to the country. We're going through a period of decline in budgets, which means we're laying people off. Let me say a word or two about the implications of sequestration, what's really happening, because there's been a certain amount of public discussion about the fact that, well, it doesn't seem to be so bad. It was quite clear well before sequestration was implemented that we weren't going to be falling off a cliff the day we implemented sequestration. What we have done instead is, and partly because of the way it's distributed across so many different lines in the budget, everybody's losing 8%, so everybody has to go figure out how to take out 8%, 8% at least. So it's very decentralized, it's very diffuse. And I made an analogy this morning at another talk about it isn't like we had this big thunderstorm that suddenly came over. It just started raining, and it just keeps raining, and the water keeps rising. And one of my assistants is with me. She's got a stack of documents. We get basically weekly reports from our agencies and from the services on what they're doing because of sequestration. And if you go through that, what you find is death of 1,000 cuts. You find the runway ramp that's not repaired, which, by the way, means that the damage that we might get from foreign objects is going that ramp up in the air. You get the things that are not being brought up to fire code because we don't have the money to do that. You get the units that are not being trained, that are staying in their barracks because we don't have money to train them. All these little things just add up and add up and add up, and they largely affect our readiness, they largely affect our ability to do our job going forward, and they set bills and inefficiencies in place that we're going to have to pay sometime later, often at higher cost. But there are thousands of them. They're all over the department right now. I get a lot of people, how many of you are seeing in some place the implications of sequestration? Just a show of hands, people are here. Seeing some way, whether it's big, small, almost everybody, okay? It's there, it's real, but in the water, as I said, the rain keeps falling, the water keeps rising. We're setting up some very inefficient things. All of our production rates are coming down to less efficient rates. That's what happens when you cut. So that's where we are. And we're setting up some bills for ourselves in FY14, which we have not accounted for, by the way, in our FY14 budget submission. So we're looking at the inefficiencies of the damage limitation efforts we're doing now across the board, and then they're going to ripple into 14. We're going to have to fix things there to the extent we can, but if we end up taking $50 billion out of 14 as well, I don't know how we're going to do that. We're going to have to make some very, very hard decisions if we have the flexibility. So anyway, coming back to people are enduring this. They're out there, they're seeing this. This is the environment they're living in. They're seeing rather a lack of support, if you will, from their government for what they're doing. It's what sequestration really amounts to at the end of the day. They're also seeing the potential for furloughs. They're seeing pay freezes over years. It's not a good climate, and keeping morale up, I wish Admiral Gortney were with me in all of my talks. I think he probably gave a good rousing talk this morning. I'm kind of the pessimist today. It's going to be tough. It's a real management challenge for all of us, and we're just going to have to step up to it. Somebody asked me at an earlier talk, what I could do. Well, there are some things we can do from a leadership perspective. One, we have to acknowledge the contributions our people are making. Let them know how much they're appreciated, and they are. What you all do, all of you who work in the industry, who work for the government, who wear the uniform, as a citizen, I'm enormously appreciative of what you do every day. And I'm probably more aware than most of the stress we're putting you under right now. So let's start with that. We need to recognize our better performers and make sure that, and I was delighted to see that happening up here on the stage earlier. We don't do nearly enough to let people know who are doing an exceptional job that they are in fact doing an exceptional job, and that we know that and that we value that. And to the extent we can, we've got to try to protect our people going forward. That's going to be difficult. The other thing I will say is that this too will pass. I've been through several cycles, and this is a cycle. We're in a cyclical industry, basically, a cyclical market, and this will pass. I mentioned peer competitors rising. That recognition will become much more evident over time, and we will see a reaction to that. I think we will see at some point a political reaction to that. But I think as this death of 1,000 cuts sort of thing of sequestration continues, we're going to have to be, as a community, more vocal about the implications. I think we have a tendency in the military in particular to say, okay, we're going to suck it up and we're going to do the best we can. I think we need to let people know. Even though individual things may be small, they all add up. They're all making things worse for the future. I want to close on a couple of things that I'm doing. I mentioned a big one, the idea of the Protect the Future issue. We're redoing, for those of you who are in the acquisition side of the house, redoing 5002, trying to put more emphasis on tailoring in the workforce. That's the document that governs the acquisition process. I'm going to try to get a legislative change through the Hill that will simplify a lot of our rules so it's easier for us to do business. Try to do some other things to reduce bureaucracy, make it easier for us to get things done without as much overhead. I don't think that's the root cause of our program problems necessarily, but I think it gets in the way and it is a cost in general. We're going to try to continue the process of better buying power, which is basically about, as I said, continuous improvement. So I'm not giving up. We've got a lot of work to do. It's a tough environment. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here and share some of my thoughts with you, and I will take any questions that you might have at this point. Thank you.
Good afternoon, sir. If you agree it is critical for the Defense Department to maintain a dialogue with industry, what are the best ways to do that given the strict travel restrictions and onerous conference approval processes?
It is critical to maintain that dialogue. I just had a meeting with Secretary Hagel and Deputy Secretary Carter with about 40 or 50, mostly CEOs that we set up. I have interactions one-on-one with various companies pretty much. My door's open, let me put it that way, and people should take advantage of it. I've pushed back against the idea that we can't talk to industry. I think there's been a little too much nervousness. I'm a lawyer, so I can say bad things about lawyers. The lawyers are a little too nervous about the period before RFPs go out. Once an RFP is out, you're kind of limited in what you can do. But up until then, you can talk to industry. And I've been trying to make sure our workforce understands that and that it should do it. That you will learn from industry. We learned a great deal as we went through both of the Better Buying Power initiative formulation phases, where we interacted with industry and got their ideas. Better Buying Power contains several things. Provisions on lowest price technically acceptable, provisions on fixed price incentive, provisions on backlog of audits from the DCAA, all of which came to a large extent from industry. So I would just encourage people to have that dialogue. I understand the constraint on conferences and what that means. I think we can defend the need for a conference that's well structured, which includes good solid interaction, which may include training, which gives industry a chance to interact with the government. I think those are healthy things to do. They're an important part of what we do. We have to be prudent, right? We can't, I'm thinking about the famous one in Las Vegas of a couple years ago, right? Now it's been a while. And some of the things that were done there, we got to use our heads, right? But if we do it well, be a little careful about venue. Where do you have it and the appearances? Because we live in a political world. There's no question about that. And the people who, for whatever reason, think we're wasting money in the Defense Department and will seize on any evidence that supports that. So we got to be careful how we do it. But we certainly should continue it. And I would encourage the whole acquisition chain of command and those, even the operational community as well, to be willing and open to dialogue with industry as much as possible.
Sir, what are your thoughts on how much India, Russia, and China are cutting their military budgets compared to us?
Russia is currently raising theirs, and so is China. I don't know if I can say any numbers on either. I think China's increases are probably sustainable for their economy. I'm not sure if Russia's are. But we're going down and they're going up is the way things are happening right now.
Can you talk to the recent European consolidation of U.S. activities review you directed, as well as your desired outcomes from the review?
Yeah, what that refers to is sometimes we call it Euro-BRAC. The Secretary asked me to lead an initiative to look at our basing in Europe. It's one of the areas where we're having some force structural reductions. And I'm conducting what is essentially a BRAC-like process to look at basing in Europe. It's a joint process. We've got a steering group that's meeting about monthly, and a lot of working groups throughout looking at different aspects of it. We're building on work that the services, to a certain extent, have already done. And the Congress reacted to our first. We sent up in the FY13 budget a request for BRAC rounds, and I like to say that they were warmly received by the Congress. So we didn't get them, of course. We were asking again, and as somebody spoke at an earlier meeting today, said that his view, this is a non-defense person, was that Congress was not reacting nearly as strongly to this BRAC request as they did last year. That's sort of encouraging, because I think if we're going to get savings, we need to take some of those savings through base reductions. We just need to. We have excess capacity. It costs money. It costs us money to sustain it. We can get very good return on BRAC. I know in a community which has a lot of bases, this is not something that's necessarily welcome, but if we have to take reductions in our workforce, in our civilian workforce, BRAC is an enabler for that. Okay, a lot of reductions in the workforce that we've taken in the past have been associated with BRAC. And if we have to take them anyway, we need to take them in a way which makes sense and doesn't do damage. And consolidation of bases is a way to do that. The Euro-BRAC, the European review is similar. It's going to be done, first. We don't need legal authority to do it. There has been, one of the reactions to the BRAC request for CONUS was that we should look overseas first. So we are doing that. We are looking overseas first. Don't know that huge savings are possible. There are some other factors that have to be considered in a Euro-BRAC, but it's one of the many, many things we're doing to try to find ways to get more for the money that we have.
Sir, this will be the last question. Is it possible to reverse the effects of sequestration within the FYDP? And if so, what exactly would that entail?
Could you read that again? I didn't hear all of that.
Is it possible to reverse the effects of sequestration within the FYDP? And if so, what exactly would that entail?
Yeah, at this point, I think so. Some of the things we're doing now have about a 2-year tail. We have to have the resource to do it, and it probably means we're going to have to not do some other things. So any of you who have been in an operational unit know this. But if you, I don't know if I talked about this earlier or not, but basically you get a unit ready. As a small unit commander, which I have been, you essentially work hard to get your unit up to a certain level of readiness. That's a combination of training and material readiness. And once you get there, then you kind of, if you're not paying attention and continuing what you have to do, you watch it kind of slowly erode over time. As people rotate out, as you don't do exercises, whatever. What we're doing is basically, and readiness is also kind of a pipeline, particularly if I take the Army. Units are trained up to a certain level, then they're deployed, they go through deployment, they come back, and they're allowed to kind of stand down for a little while, get a break, and then they have to go into a training cycle again, and to where they're eventually ready for another deployment. That's the cycle the Army and the Marine Corps have largely been on, and to a lesser extent, I think the other services too. If you just break that cycle, if you take some units and say, okay, you're not going to be prepared, and we're doing this right now, that 1,000 cuts I talked about, we're extending deployments because we can't afford to train the next guys we're going to deploy after the ones that are already out there, which is, again, is a people impact and a people implication. Some of those things we can fix in 2 or 3 years, okay? It's not instantaneous, it takes some time. But it means we're probably going to have to sacrifice some other things. So there are places where we can get behind the power curve to where it's just hard for us to catch up. I don't think anything's irreversible. And so far, we're only a few weeks into sequestration. It hasn't been going on for that long. So the things that we're doing over time will get more reversible. I come back to the point I made about stability. Once we know what we're going to have to live with, we can figure out how to get that balance that I talked about, and we can size the force structure and everything else, even though it may be a bumpy ride. We can get there. We can get to a Defense Department that we can afford and it makes sense. But until we get that stability, we're kind of dealing with this, like I said, for FY13 in a damage limitation mode, which means we're deferring some cost. We're largely deferring cost right now. You know, we're just not doing things and we're pushing it off to the future. That's you know, at some point, we got to stop doing that. If we're going to have to live with lower levels, we have to cut programs, we have to cut force structure, we have to fundamentally change the Department of Defense. The Strategic Choices Management Review is looking at some of those implications. If we did have to live with some of those more severe budget levels, what would we have to do to the department as a result? What trade-offs would we have to make? And one of the things I think it probably will be smart of us to do is to put some of those before the Congress at some point and say, okay, if you really want to do this, here's what you're going to have for a military for the United States. This is all you can afford at these levels. Now, you know, it's interesting that all the people on the Hill who rant and rave about the Defense Department spending are very quick to sign a letter to the Secretary when you cut a program that's in their district, right? You know, anything, you know, that's the politics, that's the way it works. But I think we're going to have to force people to confront some choices. Secretary Gates said this, and I think Secretary Hagel feels the same way. You know, you can't just take a big, huge hunk of money. It'll be 20% if we take another $50 billion out of the Defense Department and expect us to have the same Defense Department. And if you want us to make choices, we're going to lay them on the table for you, and you're going to have to confront them. That's really the way we should do business. That's the kind of discussion we ought to have. But until we get to some certainty about where we're actually going to be, it's kind of hard to have that conversation. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate being with you. Sorry I didn't have better news for you today.
Thank you. We have a book for you from